what if I told you that an animal that vanished from the Earth 13,000 years ago is back? It sounds like something straight out of a movie, but one company is claiming they've actually done it. Today, we're diving into the incredible and incredibly complicated story of the dire wolf's return. So, the company behind this is Colossal Biosciences, and they made a huge splash with this announcement. They claim to have brought back the dire wolf. Yeah, that dire wolf, the one made famous by Game of Thrones. They've even named the first two pups, Romulus and Remus. On the surface, this sounds like a monumental leap forward for science. But, and this is a big but, here's where the story gets really interesting. A lot of experts are raising their eyebrows, basically saying, hold on a second. They're questioning whether this is a true resurrection or something else entirely. So, have we really turned back time? To figure that out, we've got to look at what a dire wolf actually was. Right. So, before we can judge what Colossal made, we need to separate the real fossil record animal from the giant magical beast you see on TV. This timeline is pretty wild when you think about it. For more than a century, everyone just assumed dire wolves were basically beefed-up cousins of gray wolves. But then, this 2021 study in Nature just blew that idea out of the water. It turns out their evolutionary paths split almost 6 million years ago. They were not close relatives at all. They were their own, completely distinct thing. And that brings us to this, the real deal versus the TV version. Yeah, the actual dire wolf was a beast, about 25% bigger than a gray wolf with a crazy powerful bite for crushing bone. But it wasn't a horse-sized, lion-like monster. It's super important we get that straight, because it's key to what we're talking about today. Okay, so how on earth do you even attempt to bring an animal back from extinction? Well, scientists basically have 3 main playbooks, 3 different methods they can try. Each one comes with its own major hurdles. First up, you've got backbreeding. This is kind of like trying to hit rewind on evolution. You take a living relative, find individuals that have some of the old traits, and you breed them together generation after generation. A great example is the quagga project. They're breeding zebras to have fewer and fewer stripes to create something that looks just like the extinct quagga. Method 2 is cloning. You've definitely heard of this one. You create a perfect genetic copy, but, and this is the catch, you need a perfectly preserved living cell to do it. The one and only time this was tried for de-extinction, well, it gave us the really tragic story of an animal called the bucardo. Just look at this. It's heartbreaking. Scientists got cells from the very last bucardo, a type of Spanish mountain goat, right before she died. Years later, they actually did it. They created a clone. The species was back on Earth for about 10 minutes. The clone was born with a fatal lung defect and died almost immediately. The bucardo went extinct twice. It's just a brutal reminder of how insanely difficult this science is. And that brings us to method number 3, the most futuristic one of all, genetic engineering. With this, you pull ancient fragmented DNA from fossils. You then use a tool like CRISPR, which is like a pair of tiny programmable molecular scissors, to edit the DNA of a living relative to match the extinct one. And this is the path Colossal decided to take. So how exactly did Colossal follow this high-tech recipe to create their, quote-unquote, dire wolf? It's a pretty mind-blowing process. First, they actually got usable DNA fragments from a couple of ancient fossils. They compared that to a modern gray wolf and found it was a 99.5% match. Then, the key part, they identified 14 genes they believed were responsible for the dire wolf's distinct look, its size, its skull, its fur. Then, they went in with CRISPR, made 20 little edits to those 14 genes in gray wolf cells, created embryos, and implanted them in surrogate dogs. Let's just hang on this number for a second. 14. A gray wolf has something like 20,000 genes in its entire genome. They edited just 14. A tiny, almost infinitesimal fraction of the whole. And that, right there, brings us back to the million-dollar question. If you only change 14 genes, is what you've made a real dire wolf, or is it just a gray wolf dressed up in dire wolf's clothing? This line right here is everything. Yeah, a 99.5% match between a gray wolf and a dire wolf sounds like they're practically identical, right? But now look at this. Humans and chimpanzees share 98.8% of our DNA. That tiny 1.2% difference accounts for, well, everything that makes us us. All of a sudden, that 0.5% gap between a gray wolf and a dire wolf seems like a massive canyon, doesn't it? And this is really the scientific consensus.
Fiddling with 14 genes, less than 0.00001% of the total, it doesn't bring back a species that's been on its own evolutionary path for 6 million years. What you get is a genetically engineered gray wolf, one that's been designed to look like a dire wolf. It's an absolutely incredible feat of science for sure, but is it de-extinction? No, it's creating a proxy.
So, once we accept what this really is, it forces us to ask some much bigger, much more difficult questions. Questions that have less to do with genetics and more to do with ethics.
I mean, we really have to think about this stuff. What kind of life are these animals going to have living in a fancy preserve as a tourist attraction? And where would you even put them in the wild? The huge Ice Age animals they used to hunt are also extinct. Are we just creating an apex predator with no place in the modern world? And maybe the biggest question of all, with so much at stake, is this really the best use of all this money and all this brainpower?
Because it all kind of comes back to that old saying, right? We're all fascinated by this high-tech, expensive cure for extinction. But many people are arguing that we're completely ignoring the much cheaper, much more effective prevention of conservation. And this number, this just says it all. 2. That is how many northern white rhinos are left on the entire planet. A species that took millions of years to evolve is down to 2 females who can no longer breed. Mostly because of us. We are living in a mass extinction crisis right now.
And so, that's the choice we're left with. The science is amazing, it's dazzling, but it forces us to look in the mirror and ask a really tough question. As we get more and more powerful, where should we aim our efforts? Should we focus on bringing back ghosts from the past, or on saving the incredible life that's still here, fighting for a future? That's the question we all need to answer.